Hi, I'm Ty from Mark Twain Hobby Center, and today's topic, FPV. FPV. What is FPV? FPV stands for First Person View. FPV technology has been around for some time now, but it's just now becoming very popular with how popular the drones are. Of course, we use FPV to put ourselves in the perspective of the model we're flying. As you either saw on this screen or I saw in these FPV goggles, you're able to really imagine what it's like to be in the cockpit. It makes it much easier to pilot a quadcopter. FPV systems are very simple. FPV systems use a very small onboard camera and a video transmitter to send video signal back down to the pilot on a completely separate frequency from the one they're using to control the model. Now on the ground, the pilot can prefer to use a screen like this FlySight Black Pearl all-in-one screen, or they can prefer to use a set of these Fat Shark goggles that have two screens inside the goggles to receive the video transmission. Now, it really is a matter of preference. I personally prefer screens because I like to be able to look from the screen up to my model at any given time. However, nothing is more immersive than a set of goggles. And the guys that really want to be immersed in the experience would prefer the goggles. Now, one question I often get asked is whether or not people can use the goggles if they wear glasses. Almost every goggle set on the market has an optional offered set of lenses for those that wear prescription glasses. So if you've got prescription glasses and you want to wear the goggles, simply find the appropriate lens kit for your set of goggles and you should be taken care of. Also on the market are headsets that use one screen far enough away from your face that allow you to use your prescription glasses without any issue. Due to how FPV systems are packaged, it's very easy to apply them to any model you might have. All the devices responsible for FPV flight are completely standalone from your model. On your model, you'll have your camera, video transmitter, and something to power it. Because of this, you can put FPV systems on actually just about anything. FPV systems are not limited to things that fly. You could put an FPV system on an RC car or boat or truck. You don't even actually have to move what you're putting your FPV system on. So long as you have a video transmitter and a video receiver, you have an FPV system. Within each set of goggles or within each screen, there are inherently specifications that might be important to you, such as resolution, whether or not the screen is widescreen or traditional standard aspect ratio, the type of frequency you're using. The most common FPV frequency is 5.8 gigahertz. However, a handful of other frequencies are being used today. To use frequencies other than 5.8 gigahertz, you typically require an amateur radio operator's license, or also known as a ham operator's license. 5.8 gigahertz is typically legal for use on FPV purposes under or at 25 milliwatts of power. The stronger a transmitter is, the more distance you can get and the clarity of signal gets better. Now, anything higher than 25 milliwatts in 5.8 gigahertz typically requires the use of an amateur radio operator's license. It's very important that you see what regulations specifically apply to you when using any of these FPV devices, because of course they are regulated by the FCC, and the FCC can lay down some hefty fines. 5.8 gigahertz is the easiest for us to use because it is the one that is legal for anybody to use. Any other frequency such as 1.3 gigahertz, 900 megahertz, or even as low as 433 megahertz, these systems definitely require a ham operator's license, some of which aren't even technically legal in the US. However, the advantage of these systems is that they achieve much higher range. A handful of users of the Blade 350QX when it first came out thought that they could cheaply achieve FPV by turning the Wi-Fi on their GoPro. And while I mentioned Wi-Fi earlier, the Wi-Fi on a Chroma or any of those Wi-Fi based units uses 5.8 gigahertz technology. Our traditional Wi-Fi and our radio transmitters both use 2.4 gigahertz. GoPros also use 2.4 gigahertz. You would not want to use two devices that use the same frequency in conjunction with each other, otherwise you could see a flyaway or other kind of flight failure. Thusly, if you're using a 2.4 gigahertz radio transmitter, you definitely don't want to use any kind of 2.4 gigahertz FPV gear. Likewise, if you're using a 5.8 gigahertz radio transmitter, like on the early DJIs, you wouldn't want to use a 5.8 gigahertz video transmitters. If for some reason your model uses a 5.8 GHz transmitter, you would not want to use a 5.8 GHz FPV system because it could result in a flight failure or a flyaway. Some other important things to note about FPV antennas. This here is a circularly polarized antenna. These are typically a lot better than stock antennas. However, a lot of these goggle kits come with this style of antenna. Antennas can be folding dipole antennas like what you see on your transmitter. They can be circularly polarized, or they can be directional antennas designed to be pointed directly at a model. The type of antenna can drastically affect your signal strength and picture quality. Some types of FPV use actual Wi-Fi as opposed to a raw signal. Still operating on 5.8 GHz, these systems require some form of encryption and typically use an iPhone 5, 6, or some of the Android phones to maintain a link between your model and your phone. The Blade Chroma packages that have the ST10 transmitter and the Seago gimbal use that 5.8 GHz Wi-Fi to achieve FPV. There are a few notable drawbacks with that Wi-Fi system. Typically, because they're using encryption, there's a slight bit of lag. It's not nearly as good for the immersive experience as a set of goggles. But because of its ease of use and its compatibility with other non-FPV related devices such as your phone, it's easy to get an FPV system set up with your iPhone or your Samsung phone, whichever has the 5.8 GHz Wi-Fi. Now, because it has an encryption, you typically can only use one device at once, whereas with an FPV goggles or FPV screen using traditional FPV transmissions, you can see I'm using both at once because it's a raw signal. This makes it interesting if you attend any event where the FPV is being used, because if you have your goggles with you, you can tune into the channel that's being used and see from the perspective of a drone. Now, one of the most popular uses for FPV that's growing is FPV racing. FPV racing revolves around pilots flying small quadcopters very fast through obstacle courses to see who can achieve the best time. Often these FPV races can have as many as 8 pilots operating all at once on different frequencies, and they can be very fast-paced. A handful of videos on YouTube have already made their way into the limelight, showing just how fun and fast this hobby can be. Now, I mentioned in another video, it's very important to pay attention to the rules revolving around FPV and not to use it for anything inherently criminal or to violate anyone's privacy. The AMA, FAA, and FCC all have rules, guidelines, and regulations that pertain to FPV. And it's very important that you pay attention to those rules that apply to you and pay attention to how they change, because they are changing rapidly, just as this hobby changes rapidly. The AMA recommends that you do not fly out of line of sight, and if you insist upon flying FPV, that you also have an FPV spotter to pay attention to the model and relay any important information should you need to take the goggles off. Another important use of FPV is aerial photography. Of course, what good is an aerial photography quadcopter if you're not capable of actually knowing what the quadcopter is pointing at and what you're shooting? Models like this Blade Chroma feature FPV systems that allow you to see where your camera is pointing and know how far down it's tilted when you want to tilt it. It seems foolish to get into any kind of aerial photography without any kind of FPV system in mind. Otherwise, you'll not be able to know where the camera is pointed. Alright, that's the basics of FPV and FPV flight. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below and ask them. Otherwise, thanks for watching and please subscribe.